Okay, so one of the things that we need to get to understand is the way that these four legendary kings interact with each other. They are not real, as far as anybody knows. The chronology isn't accurate. So Rome was probably founded in the 12th or 13th century, and Roman historians claim that Rome was created on the 21st of April, 753 BCE. A very precise date, which was chosen for religious rather than historical reasons. And as you can see from these dates, the claim that only four kings ruled from 753 to 617 BCE is highly unlikely, especially if you consider that people, got sick and there was a lot of war. We've got Fabius Pictor and other Roman historians who believed that Rome's systems were added over time and that nothing was removed. So the Republic kept Romulus's systems. It just replaced the kings with magistrates. So in reality, the systems that the literary tradition describes were probably developed over a much greater period of time than we see here. So now we know Romulus is legendary, and he did not create the Senate or the patron-client system, the assembly, or any of these laws. So why are we studying a legend and not a historical fact? Well, primarily, the legend of Romulus tells us a lot about the spirit of the Roman people. So the kinds of people they are, the kinds of things that they valued. So by looking at these four legendary kings, we see the things that the Romans, the later Romans, at the time of Livy and Dionysius, wanted the world to think they were like. So we don't have any better idea of what happened. We have no historical record. So this is what they thought of themselves. So when we come to Romulus as a politician, because Romulus is the one that they credit with having created the Roman state as a political entity, there are a number of things that Roman historians claim that Romulus created. So asylum is one of them, that he began by granting citizenship to people. So once Rome existed, he was lacking in people that were part of his society. So Dionysius tells us that Romulus built a temple now this is a good quote, so I've written it down for you, in the space between the two groves for asylum seekers escaping tyranny. For example, the Greeks. Now this is important because Dionysius, throughout his writings, emphasizes what is important about the Greeks, that he pushes the idea of the Greeks as the basis for Roman society. Now Livy, on the other hand, says that Romulus invited in criminals and outcasts. And interestingly, Livy is much more Rome-centric, Roman. He's less interested in Greek as a background. We also have Romulus as building walls, so he creates safety for his people. He fortified the Palatine Hill, and there is noted in the late 80s, I think, or the early 90s, they discovered foundation ditches for wooden walls, which seem to date from the 8th century BCE. Now, some people suggest that this supports the actual existence of Romulus, but most historians refute this because city walls were common. They were essential in the 8th century BCE because of the amount of war that was going on, attacks all the time. So the discovery of these Roman walls does not prove the existence of Romulus, but it does support the development of the urbanization of Rome. He also built the representation. So it's very unlikely that Romulus did this, because this is the sort of complexity which would really have to have developed over a large period of time. But at the heart of the system of Rome is the what they call the patron-client system, or the patron of the populations, which are the patriarchs, and their clients, or their dependents, who are called the plebeians. So 100 of Rome's best men, who were called the patriarchs, would act as patrons, so they offered leadership and guidance to the rest of Rome's population, who were the plebeians, who would serve as their clients. In exchange for legal protection, the clients would perform tasks like fighting or farming or whatever the patriarchs needed to do, while the patriarchs did all the governing. So you could call this a sort of a representative government, because the patriarchs would take the needs of the plebeians and discuss them and work out how the things could be implemented. So this could be called a form of proto-democracy, where there is one person gets a vote. So Dionysius says in his Roman Antiquities, he says, Romulus decreed that the patricians would help him run Rome. They would become the priests, the magistrates, and the judges. Romulus declared that the plebeians would become the farmers and the tradesmen. They did not have the intelligence or the free time to become involved in public office. So it's quite paternalistic, the idea that these ordinary people didn't have the intelligence. I mean, obviously they wouldn't have had the free time because they were working so hard, but there wasn't the sort of level of education that we would expect now, and it was mostly men, obviously. So Dionysius tells us that Romulus divided the people into 3 tribes, each divided into 10 curiae, which were sub-regions, which sent a representative to a council called the Comitia Curiata. Now, Livy doesn't mention the Comitia Curiata at all, but he just says, under Romulus and the other kings, each citizen, regardless of his status, had 1 vote, which is where we get back to the idea of proto-democracy, because ultimately that's what Rome is going to claim as its political situation. So these 100 patriarchs also served in Romulus's Senate. So they advised the king, and they were appointed for life. So they were the ones that were telling the king what the people needed. And Livy tells us that Romulus struggled to find enough patriarchs to serve him because the king was the most important person and he ruled by decree. So what that means is he just decided what to do without listening to other people or following a law or precedents. And so he had to have lictors who were his bodyguards. And in fact, Livy suggests that the Senate murdered Romulus for acting like a tyrant. Go figure. There will be more about that later on. But for now, what we've got is the Senate, as portrayed by Livy, is an important check to the king's power. So it begins to build the idea of checks and balances, which will ultimately build into democracy. Now, the Roman hierarchy is tyrant at the top, which is, at this point, the imaginary Romulus. Then we've got the senators underneath him, the lictors, who are the bodyguards, and then so the military, and then the farmers and the workers. So this thing is in your notebook, so I'd like you to have a little look at page 13 in the textbook, work out the numbers, put them all in so that you know how many there was of each and what types of people. Were they patricians or were they the plebeians who were doing this, and what was the way that power was exercised. So how did they do what they needed to do for their jobs? Well, Romulus and his religious initiatives, well, there isn't much, not really. Livy suggests that the Romans adopted the local customs. So Romulus built a temple to Jupiter to commemorate his military successes. And you'll find when you read through the Livy that Romulus several times invokes Jupiter when he wins battles. That Romulus was also influenced by the Greek legends of Heracles and that when he dies, which we will, as I say, come back to later, he is transformed into a god. Dionysius, on the other hand, Dionysius gives us a complicated system of a Greek system of religion using a lot of Greek terminology. So Dionysius embraces the Greek roots of Roman religion. So all the stuff that we've done in classics about Jupiter and his Greek other half, those kinds of things come into play here. Now, the archaeology, on the other hand, has found that the Roman religious practices grew over a long period of time and was in fact influenced by many other cultures. So yes, there were Greek influences, but there were also Etruscan and Apennine, and then there's also this Latial Villanovan and Urnfield cultures. And there is an example of this is the Casa Romuli, which is otherwise called the Hut of Romulus, which is on the Palatine Hill, and it is in the shape of a Villanovan hut. So this indicates influence of cultures north of Rome, up into the Etruscans and the Sabines in the north. Well, Romulus and the military. Okay, so there was quite a lot. Dionysius explains how Romulus organized Rome's army. Dionysius says that Romulus's army was so well organized that when he summoned his army, they appeared with arms at the designated post and time. So that's quite an important reference, that you would remember that Romulus's army was well organized. Again, there's one of these sort of triangular ideas that the military tribune at the top, and they were the men who organized the military service, and they organized the call to arms for each tribe. So if they needed to come out, the military tribune did the organizing. Underneath them was the centurion, who commanded each unit, and each unit was called a century, which typically had 60 to 100 men in it. There's a secondary layer, which is the cavalry. The celeres was a cavalry unit, and they were described as Romulus's most loyal soldiers, and they acted as his bodyguards in battle on horseback. Over time, the celeres unit may have developed, but it was a cavalry unit, which was drawn from the eques. Now, the eques were a social class who were given horses from the state and formed the Roman cavalry. It is likely that the Roman historians used legions, centuries, and celeres units to describe Romulus's army because these terms were more familiar to the educated Roman elite. So basically, what did Livy and Dionysius really know about ancient Roman tactics? Well, probably not much. They didn't have the kind of resources that we have in order to identify historically accurate information. So Livy, for example, describes Rome's war with the city of Fidenae, which we will also talk about in a different recording, by using tactics used by Hannibal, the Carthaginian leader, when he invaded Italy in the 3rd century BCE. So he basically just uses known tactics to show what historical leaders might have done. So they're making things up to create a mythological basis to support the power of Rome, as you can see here. Now, the death of Romulus. So when these deathless deeds had been done, as the king was holding a muster in the camps of Martius near the swamp of Capra for the purpose of reviewing the army, suddenly a storm came up with loud claps of thunder and enveloped him in a cloud so thick as to hide him from the sight of the assembly. And from that moment, Romulus was no more on earth. And if you look down a couple more lines, people readily believed the assertion of the senators who had been standing next to Romulus that he had been caught up on high in the blast. So again, this is going back to the idea of how the Roman kings became gods. And when you come to people like Emperor Augustus, they declared themselves gods. So here, what Livy is doing is he is making a connection between the deification of emperors and Romulus, so he's much more legendary. And you can see also, if you think about it, echoes of things in the Bible, in the Jewish section, the Old Testament, such as Elijah being taken up to heaven in his in a fiery carriage. And however, Livy does go on. Now, if you look down a little bit further to the next quote, Livy goes on to suggest, he says, there were some, I believe, even then, who secretly asserted that the king had been rent in pieces by the hands of the senators. Now, rent in this case means ripped or torn. So that is much more prosaic, much less kind of exciting, but much more practical. If Romulus was indeed acting like a tyrant and acting by decree instead of allowing the senators to have a say in the governing of the city, they may well have felt that getting rid of Romulus was a good plan. So this story was emphasized by this fellow, Proculus Julius, who says, Quirites, the father of this city, Romulus, descended suddenly from the sky at dawn this morning and appeared to me. So, you know, when he heard the rumors, he starts to say, Romulus came down this morning at dawn and told me. I stood reverently before him. And he says, go and declare to the Romans the will of heaven. There we are. That my Rome shall be the capital of the world. Go, so let them cherish the art of war, and let them know and teach their children that no human strength can resist Roman arms. So, and then Livy says, it is wonderful what credence the people placed in that man's tale. So they're mythologizing, they're creating a story about the power of Rome, about the art of war, and about the power of the Senate to control government. After the death of Romulus, Livy tells us that the death of Romulus gave the Senate the chance to take the power for themselves. So for 1 year, the interregnum, which means between reigns, when the normal government is suspended, the Senate tried to rule, but it failed, because the Senate existed to serve the patricians. But the plebeians became angry, causing civil unrest, as I mentioned earlier. So to restore the order, the Senate chose a new leader, Numa Pompilius, and that will be our next video.